For the final part of the afternoon, our first speaker is David L. Barquist, who is the H. Richard Dietrich Jr. Curator of American Decorative Arts at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and he's held this position since 2004. David studied fine arts at Harvard College and received an MA from the Winterthur program at the University of Delaware, and obtained his PhD in history of art from Yale. From 1981 to 2004, he served as assistant, associate, and then acting curator of American Decorative Arts at the Yale University Art Gallery at New Haven. His books include American Tables and Looking Glasses and the Mabel Brady Garvan and Other Collections at Yale University, 1992, and Maya Myers, Jewish Silversmith in Colonial New York of 2011. This was the subject of his dissertation and the catalogue for a travelling exhibition between 2001 and 2002. He also co-organised the 2008-9 travelling exhibition Setting the President's Table, American Presidential China from the Robert L. McNeill Jr. collection at the Philadelphia Museum. And in 2013, he contributed the essay From the Andes to the Amazon, Silver in Colonial South America, to the catalogue for the exhibition Journeys to New World, Spanish and Portuguese Colonial Art in the Roberta and Richard Huber collection at the Philadelphia Museum of Art as well. This is just some of his numerous publications and articles and so forth. And currently he is assisting with the completion of a catalogue of the American Silver collection at the Philadelphia Museum. And so it's a great pleasure to welcome him today to talk about the cheapest of cheap forms of ore pottery, American Majolica, 1870 to 1900. Welcome, David.
I trust I got everyone's attention with that title. There we go. So my focus today is on the American Majolica wares, and I want to thank Susan Weber and Andrew and the Bard Center for allowing the Americanists to poke their nose into the tent of Majolica things, although I know that many people here are fans of the American wares. And I thought I would begin by just reminding us all that real Majolica was actually made in the Americas from the beginnings of European settlement, particularly in the Spanish and Portuguese areas, and in fact a very distinguished tradition in Puebla in Mexico of the so-called Talavera wares existed for several hundred years. It's actually surprising that there's so little evidence that there was any attempt to make Delftware or other tin-glazed wares in the British and French colonies in the Americas, or the Dutch colonies for that matter, given the long histories that we've all heard about of tin-glazed production in the European countries. I show you a newspaper advertisement that's in the Massachusetts Gazette in 1765 about a gentleman lately from England who has lately set up a pottery about 9 miles from this being Charleston, South Carolina, has met with good clay for his purpose, that he scarce doubts of his wares exceeding that of Delft. This, I believe, is a reference to John Bartlam, who was a Staffordshire potter who came to South Carolina in 1763. The factory site, which is at a place called Cane Hoy, has been excavated, and they have found evidence of both cream-colored ware and porcelain. In fact, he is now known as the earliest American maker of porcelain, but there are no sherds of tin-glazed earthenware. So the newspaper person may have been using Delft just as a kind of metaphorical reference. The object below it is actually a piece of American tin-glaze ware that was made in Winchester, Virginia in 1825, and they're by John Bell. And the Bell family does seem to have briefly made red earthenware with a tin glaze on it in the Shenandoah Valley, but it's a very isolated kind of occurrence. And I should say that when we get to the story of 19th century Majolica, which is what we're here to talk about today, certainly these historical antecedents were probably unknown to the potters that were working in the United States. And in fact, the earliest Majolica, self-described a Majolica that's produced in the United States in the 1850s, seems to have had very little consciousness of historical precedent. And that, I think, distinguishes it considerably from all of the European examples that we've been looking at so far. Now, what was done in the 1850s is a little problematic to identify. And I'm going to begin by referencing the ceramic historian Edwin Adley Barber, who wrote the book that we still all rely on, The Pottery and Porcelain of the United States, in 1893, chronicling the history of American ceramic production. And he talks about the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, and says that the firm of Edwin and William Bennett of Baltimore exhibited historical wares at the show that included a Majolica bust of Washington made by E&W Bennett in 1850. If they made a Majolica bust of Washington in 1850, they're ahead of Mr. Minton. So it's a little hard to know, because of course we cannot now identify this object, what either Bennett or Barber meant by Majolica exactly. I'm assuming they mean it's a refined light-colored earthenware with colored enamel glazes on it. But again, we don't know. They also, the piece that's at the upper right of the screen here, let's see if I can figure out how to use this. This picture here, which is a model that was made by the Bennett firm in the first half of the 1850s, modeled by Charles Coxon, the so-called marine pitcher, which obviously has a lot to do with Palissy and the whole taste for this kind of naturalistic ware, if somewhat watered down. But it was primarily made by the Bennett firm in Rockingham glaze, or in this this sort of blue tinted glaze. There's this single painted version that exists in a private collection that seems to be a kind of Majolica version of this model, although it's hard to know exactly when it was made, because the Bennett firm continues into the 1890s, and this could be a sort of late casting of the model that was decorated when Majolica wares were more fashionable. One of the surviving pieces that we can identify from the 1850s is this vase by E&W Bennett that was exhibited in Chicago in 1893. And Barber describes it as a modeled Majolica vase, 2 feet in height, produced by him in 1856. So again, this is very early in the relatively speaking, in the Majolica world. But and I have not seen this piece in person. It's at the National Museum of American History in Washington, where it was donated by Bennett's grandson. But I think even from this black and white photograph, we can see, although it is a molded, light-colored earthenware, it has a sort of a, not exactly a Rockingham glaze, but it has this kind of mottled glaze, which is described as being olive yellow brown. And so that's one of the things that Barber is calling Majolica ware. It's not what Mr. Minton, obviously, was calling Majolica ware. So to some extent, these early attempts may be a matter of terminology. And I should say that big exhibition pieces like this are extremely rare in the American Majolica story. The Americans did not try to do these sort of complicated pieces that were done for the exhibitions that we've been enjoying all day today. Another important early potter, at least as credited by Barber, is the New York City pottery under the English immigrant James Carr. And he credits them with making Majolica as early as 1853, which again is exactly when Minton is starting up. Barber noted that Carr's primary focus was on producing Parian porcelain and bone china, but also commented, for a period of about 2 years, he continued the manufacture of Majolica and made a large variety of ornamental designs in pitchers, vases, sardine and matchboxes, comports and centerpieces, in addition to the standard forms of useful ware. Now, the photograph I'm showing you on the right is Carr's exhibit at the Philadelphia Centennial in 1876. So this is now 20 years later. And it's, in fact, the only American exhibit at the Centennial for which there's a photographic record. And there is Majolica in this display. And I draw your attention particularly, this is a Parian bust of Washington, but sitting on a Majolica pedestal, which is ornamented with the scene of Washington crossing the Delaware. So Minton was doing Rubens, and James Carr was doing Emanuel Leutze. And I don't know that I want to put a value judgment on that, but the American sense of history, shall we say, was shorter than the European one. But you can sort of pick out, if you stare at this long enough, you can kind of pick out a few Majolica pieces here and there in Carr's display. And it's worth noting that, in fact, there was real Majolica at the Centennial. This is the Farina company from Faenza's exhibit on the left, which was exhibited under the title Farina Artistic Ceramic Company. And although the charger on the right is actually from after post-centennial, that's 1882. But this exhibit did not excite the kind of interest that this exhibit did, which, as many of you will recognize, is the A.B. Daniel and Son display at the Centennial of Minton wares. And this, of course, which included, by the way, a version of the Prometheus vase. And it, of course, created a sensation among the American public. One of the Centennial publications commented, "They make a superb exhibit which is much visited, much admired, and no doubt has been profitable to the exhibitors. If no others exhibited in these industries, Messrs. Daniel's exhibit of Majolica and faience would make a creditable exhibition in itself." And the judges of the Centennial particularly singled out the umbrella stands that you see there in the foreground, and know from this image, which they described as a pair of full-size storks are remarkable as successful specimens of modeling and potting. I'm sure many of you wish you could walk into that booth and go shopping after the symposium was over. There were actually wares made specifically in England, made specifically for the Centennial market. This is William T. Copeland and Sons' Centennial vase. Designed and manufactured expressly for the exhibition of 1876, and also sold exclusively through the New York retailer J.M. Shaw and Company, because they anticipated correctly that there would be an enormous American response to the Majolica shown at the Centennial. And in fact, in the following year, in September 1877, the Pottery and Glass Trades Review reported 3 or 4 years ago, Majolica, Parian, tiles, Chinese or Japanese porcelains would be very rarely found outside of New York, Boston, or Philadelphia. Whereas now, every dealer in a town of any importance finds it necessary to carry a fair stock of such goods and finds a ready sale for them. The more we get of artistic goods, either home or foreign, the more they will be appreciated and sought after, and thereby the art taste of the masses increased. So, not surprisingly, many American potteries decided that it was time to produce Majolica, and there are far too many for me to cover in the short time that I have this afternoon. So I'm going to focus on just a few. It's also important to remember, and I think this has been a theme of several speakers, is that the craze for Majolica was really a short-lived one in the United States. It begins really with it really shifts into high gear with the Centennial, and it's already on the wane within a decade. So although production continued in some cases until the early 20th century, the real high point was the later 1870s and the 1880s. Now, the imported English wares had a profound impact on the American manufacturers. They had essentially started the craze. So the Americans decided that the sincerest form of flattery was imitation, and they began copying English wares greatly. But they again focused not so much on the historicist wares, the Renaissance-inspired wares that were so popular in Europe, and instead focused primarily on the naturalistic wares, because again, the American consumers seem not to have been as interested in the Palissy style. Now, the piece I'm showing you on the screen, which is at the Brooklyn Museum, is made by James Carr's pottery and carved by a man named Henry Lancaster. And it's not dated, it's a little unclear as to when this was produced. And I'm very grateful to my colleague Caroline Hanna for her thoughts on this piece. Clearly, it's got my Majolica colors on it, and it's a somewhat Renaissance-inspired design, but we think it's a one-off. It's not something that Carr ever put into production. So it's a little bit outside of the mainstream. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Charles Riebert's book on American Majolica, and he attributed this dish to James Carr's pottery, which I don't know of a marked example of this form, although there may be someone in this room who does. And in fact, most American Majolica was not marked by the makers, so it's a little frustrating to try and trace match pieces to factories. And speculation has been that the reason the Americans did not mark their wares is that, of course, they wanted people to think that they were English, not American, since the English things carried a premium. But clearly, this was something inspired by English models, and I show you here a Wedgwood Argenta pitcher that is clearly of the same aesthetic idea. Although when you start to compare the platter to the pitcher, the Wedgwood piece has more sophisticated modeling and more delicate kind of colors. So I don't necessarily want to subscribe to the theory that if it's inferior, it's American, but I think one can say that the American wares did not always meet the aesthetic standards of their English counterparts. Another company that made Majolica was D.F. Haynes and Company of Baltimore, which operated the Chesapeake Pottery, and you see here one of their advertisements for what they called Avalon Faience, which was introduced in 1882-83. The advertisement says that it is entirely new, but of course, as we've just seen, it's pretty dependent on the Wedgwood Argenta ware, which was introduced in 1878. It has the same idea of an off-white colored textured background with a limited palette of colored decoration on it. And in fact, like many of these American potteries, the craftsman responsible for introducing the line was an English immigrant, Frederick Hackney, who was hired by Haynes from Wedgwood, in fact, to, quote, take charge of the manufacture of artistic wares. One of my favorite companies is the Eureka Pottery of Trenton, New Jersey, who made this ice cream set. They unfortunately were a very short-lived firm from 1883 to 1887. They had a disastrous fire, as many potteries did, in 1887 and never came back into business. And again, it's a fantastic, wonderful conception, but clearly looking at English models like the well-known Wedgwood bird and fan style pieces. I'm fascinated by the ice cream set because the Majolica craze coincided at the same time, or the two kind of fed each other, for the taste for having table settings that differed from course to course. And in 1878, William Cox Prime, who's a well-known writer on ceramics of the time, wrote, "A very simple rule for the guidance of those who wish to have their tables admired is to avoid in successive courses the endless repetition of the same service. Have a number of sets of plates and use a different set for each course. Then buy plates, no two of which are alike except in shape, and thus make harlequin servances to vary the entertainment." And certainly that ice cream set is a Harlequin service if there ever were. Now, the best-known American manufacturer is Griffin Smith and Company of Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, and I'm going to focus on them for the rest of my time. They were originally founded in 1867 as a fire brick manufacturer for the Phoenix Iron Company, which occupied the adjacent property. And it was initially called the Phoenix Pottery, Kaolin, and Fire Brick Company. But they hired a superintendent, W.A.H. Schreiber, who had ambitions to make the pottery more than just a fire brick company. And he began making Rockingham wares as well as Parian. And you see on the right a Rockingham teapot, which is marked not by the pottery, but with a patent date that is a design patent that was issued to Schreiber. And then on the left, another scene of Faust and Marguerite. This is a lithopane, which actually is marked by the pottery. It's going to be very hard to see in the slide, but it actually says Phoenix Pottery right up there. That's part of their Parian production. This version of the firm began to suffer financial difficulties, and in 1878, a new partnership was formed with Henry Griffin, who was the son of the Phoenix Iron Company's superintendent. So again, the Iron Company is the kind of invisible hand behind all of this. David Smith, who was an immigrant potter from Stoke-on-Trent, who had also worked in Trenton, New Jersey, and then William Hill, about whom we don't really know much, and he disappears within 2 years, and it becomes Griffin Smith and Company. And one of the reasons they're one of the most celebrated of the American companies is that, unlike most of their competitors, they marked their wares. And you see a range of their marks here. And they adopted the name Etruscan for their Majolica line. And they also issued a catalog, as you can see, in 1884, which of course makes it even easier to identify their work. Here's an image of the factory in Phoenixville in the late 1880s. You see the kilns poking up there through the roof line, as you have in these other factory pictures. Again, a lovely smoke. Phoenixville must have been pretty much like Stoke-on-Trent if you had an iron forge going in the next lot. And here are some of the workmen in the factory. And just to give you an idea of the scale of the enterprise, in the 1880 census, Griffin Smith and Company employed 97 people. By 1884, they had 140 employees. So they were riding the crest of the Majolica wave. In terms of their designs, they were, like most of their competitors, closely copying English models. On the right is a Griffin Smith and Company cheese bell, and on the left, one from Thomas Forrester and Sons of Longton, Staffordshire. And you can see the debt that they owed to their English competitors. And it's worth comparing it to the illustration in the trade catalog, because you can see the color. It's down here at the lower right. You can see the colors are different, and they actually, there's quite a bit of color variation in the Griffin Smith and Company wares. And the factory employed largely women as the decorators, and here's a group of the decorating team, as well as children, male children. Again, at the peak, they employed between 50 and 60 decorators who were paid between $5 and $10 a week for their work. Now, one of the few Renaissance-style wares that they produced was was a series of wares. There was a compote and a taza, and then what this was called a jewel tray that have with these dolphin bases that are clearly indebted to something like the dolphin taza made by Minton, which interestingly is a model from 1852 at Minton, and the Griffin Smith Company piece is almost 30 years later. So they're still recycling these ideas that in England had already probably gone somewhat out of style. But it's interesting that in Barber's Pottery and Porcelain of the United States, it's these dolphin pieces that he singles out for praise by Griffin Smith and Company and calls them refined and artistic. And I show you again the page from the catalog just again to underscore in the catalog, there's a sort of naturalistic colored shell, whereas on the object that's at the PMA, we have this kind of mottled thing. Now, there were English designers there. Barber notes that one of the designers at Griffin Smith and Company was an English artist by the name of Bourne, who one scholar has identified as Hamlet Bourne, who worked at both Minton and Wedgwood. And I'm showing you Wedgwood's athletic jug in the Argenta line, which you see here, which served as the model for the Griffin Smith and Company version, but you will notice that there's a difference if we're talking about nationalistic themes. Cricket sells in Pennsylvania, but basically nowhere else, and so they put baseball players instead of cricket players. You'll also notice that the colors of the Griffin Smith and Company piece are more pastel in character, and that's kind of a characteristic of their work. They're much less vivid than the English pieces, for the most part. They also made forms in the aesthetic and Japanese style, like this wonderful little sunflower, what they called a fruit dish in the catalog. But their best sellers was the shell and seaweed line. And these were most popular with this kind of iridescent variegated color, and probably with many of you as well. Interestingly, in the 1884 catalog, the shell and seaweed wares are consistently more expensive than any other tableware patterns. The teapots were $7.40 per dozen. Wouldn't you like to buy them at that price? Versus the bamboo one that I just showed you, which was $6 per dozen. The cups and saucers like this were $3 per dozen versus the bamboo ones at $2. So this was always a sort of premium ware. And Griffin Smith and Company did produce some exhibition wares. This vase and ewer were designed for the 1884 World's Industrial and Cotton Centennial Exposition in New Orleans, where they won a gold medal. They're not a unique exhibition piece. They did offer these on the marketplace. And they're a rare use of kind of American patriotic historicist ornament. Baseball players aside, this is about as overtly American as things get, notice the colonial fellow here with his tri-corner hat as the spout of the pitcher, and of course the arms of the United States on the sides. The 1884 exposition and the gold medal were the high point, I think, for Griffin Smith and Company. And by the late 1880s, the taste is turning away from their colored Majolica. And according to some sources, and I can't say that I can prove this, they introduced the so-called albino version of the shell and seaweed ware at this time to suit the taste for less vivid colors. And they had all along offered some of their designs in white ware with gold edging, like the oyster plate that you see on the right. They suffered a disastrous fire in December of 1890 and then struggled to stay in business thereafter. They reopened the following year but then closed again in 1892. And as far as we know, they never made Majolica after the 1890 fire. And the handwriting, in any case, was on the wall about Majolica. The Crockery and Glass Journal observed in 1886, Majolica, as known to the ancients of 3 years ago, is now no more. Towards the end of its career, it degenerated into the cheapest of all cheap forms of pottery, and eventually reached such a low ebb that it could not be given away, even at wholesale. And as many of you know, the Griffin Smith pieces were actually premiums offered by the A&P grocery firm. Some of the things made then were in shocking bad taste, the making of which was a crime against the laws of artistic simplicity. I hope you know that I don't agree with that sentiment. I think that the American Majolica wares are wonderful and they're an important part of our ceramic history. Thank you.
David actually has to leave slightly early before the end of the session, so I think we'll take questions, any questions that you might have now. So, yeah.
I think I've read somewhere about the other reason for decline in the American, but also the Majolican taste in America in the late 19th century, to do with economic depression at that time and the lack of.
Well, 1893, there's the
yeah.
big panic. Yeah, so imported goods were much more expensive. Absolutely.
But it seems the taste had already gone before that. Yeah. Okay.
If you believe the Crockery and Glass Journal, which
Right.
you know, which was an interesting, which is a publication with a nationalistic agenda. So they're always anti-European. They're trying to promote the American industry. So Majolica might have had some kind of an American.
I have a surprise for you that I grabbed as I left my house for you to show. Silver Star Baking Company. You may read that.
Oh my! Silver Star baking powder, and with every 1 pound you can get a handsome Majolica water pitcher, spittoon, plate, pickle dish, on and on, molasses jug. Remember, one of the foregoing list with every 1 pound can. Isn't that
And
fabulous?
show the picture on the.
It's a little girl in a sort of blue tutu who's poised on the back of a dragonfly. It looks like. This is as good as it gets in the Victorian period.
I grabbed that as I
That's
left the house.
fabulous.
Do you have any idea what year that was?
Uh,
1880s?
It
was
It
fantastic.
said, I mean, that's what it was.
Question at the back.
Yeah, I'd like to say that, how things retain or how things become popular is that one fashion goes out and another one comes in. And that's about the time that arts and crafts came in. And everybody was saying, simpler now, we can go forward. And that's why John went out of style, essentially, is that they started a different kind of look.
Absolutely, it's the arts and crafts aesthetic of the smooth surface with the painted decoration, as opposed to the molded surface is the taste that comes in, for sure.
And it's best for the manufacturer because they have to bring something in new so they can sell something new.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about the fate of the American Majolica in the 20th century?
Well, I think Edwin Atlee Barber, certainly at the PMA, I can tell you that history, which is that Edwin Atlee Barber put together a really important reference collection by many of these potters, which of course in the 1940s, at the nadir of the Victorian moment's popularity, the museum deaccessioned. So in terms of museum collecting, I think we did the same thing that the V&A and other institutions did, which is we wanted to sort of fortunately, we didn't sell everything. The fact that Cheese Bell was one of the first pieces of Majolica that the museum acquired in 1895. So we still have some things, but it's only recently, and I think thanks to the efforts of people in this room, that it's become more popular with curators, museums, and more visible. We have a display of Griffin, Smith and Company up at the museum, so come and see it.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very
you.
much.